Good morning and welcome to another week of Journey with Christ. I am Mark Mitchell, your host this week, and I'm the preaching minister at the Park Avenue Church of Christ in Charleston, West Virginia. I am joined, as usual, by Steve Fox, a minister for over 50 years in the Kanawha Valley. How you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing okay because my 10 grandkids all wanted a white Christmas and we got one. Didn't make any.
Did you tell them, hey, that was my gift to you?
That was my gift. That's all I'm buying this year. You got white stuff on the ground. That's it. But they were very happy with that, and I know a lot of people were. Let me say one thing about our situation. I was never so glad to see a year end as I was 2020. It's getting here. And you'd had to, we're going to get rid of it, but it's going to be screaming and hollering when we try to pull it down the road. It's been awful, especially those people, of all those hundreds of people that lost relatives. I can't imagine what that's like. And so I guess if we keep going back to saying that God is in control, He certainly is. But you start to wonder, you start to have doubts about, listen, if I can see this, how come He can't see this? Well, His time schedule is a whole lot better than mine. His calendar is worked out a whole lot better than mine. So that's where our faith and trust, that's where the confidence comes from.
Well,
and that's what Revelation is all about.
Yeah. To me, this is a divisive issue as far as it relates to God is in control, and as I've shared with you, and I've shared on, I find it disingenuous to everything that happens on this planet to blame it on God, because He has told us throughout Scriptures that we produce our own tragedies too.
Questions like, did God have a plan for Adolf Hitler?
Yeah.
Pretty bad plan if God was in control of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But saying that God is still not sovereign and working, you and I have said this before. One of my favorite lines in all of the Bible is when Joseph looks at his brothers and they're afraid that when he dies, his children are going to kill him. And he said, "Listen, no, what you intended as harm, God used for good." That is an understanding that humanity needs to grab hold of.
It's Genesis 50:20. It's my favorite verse in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Because there were a couple times in my life where I hung on to that verse.
Yeah. What someone intended for bad, God's going to use for good.
Mm-hmm.
And He did. He saved them. So, yeah. I'm like you. I think I can't wait for 2020 to be done. But at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, just because the calendar's changing, the circumstances of this world, the circumstances of pandemics, racial rioting, political unrest, the circumstances of people, that's not going to change just because the calendar flipped over.
Kind of like Congress.
Yeah, we still got them, and they're still there, and so nothing's going to change until those living today begin to make changes in their lives. And that's going back to your point about Revelations. That is the letter of Revelations being sent to the people of that time. Says, "Hey, listen, there's some bad stuff coming your way."
Well, let me remind our listening audience, the 3 people that watch us every week, let me remind you that, and we haven't talked about this for a while, the first 3 verses in Revelation 1 say it's talking about things that are going to shortly come to pass. So these people, the time is near. That's chapter 1, verse 3. These people who are reading this in the first century don't have the blinders on like we do.
Yeah.
We're separated by culture and language and religion, and sometimes it amazes me that we understand anything about the Bible because we are very, very separated from those first individual books.
Yeah, we don't have. A lot of these people are invested not only historically, if you were a Jew, I mean, this has been your story since Abraham. So, actually, Noah, you know, pick up one of those sons. But, and you're also invested in the fact that you know people who saw the resurrected Jesus and who are still around and who are writing books and giving you, let's say, a newspaper version of what's going on in the world often. But you're reading the newspaper and it doesn't look good. I mean, headlines read, World War III's coming. If we woke up today and that was in our newspaper, what would happen here? There would be unrest. There would be all kinds of issues going on.
It'd be 2020 times 10.
Yeah, I mean, and who's to say that that's not possible either?
Yeah.
So,
well, before we look into these two chapters, I'd like to say one more thing as an introductory note. When we're going to start with the last part of 13 in just a minute.
12.
That's why I said we're going to start with 12 in just a minute. But as I was reading this week, read 2 or 3 of these chapters together, all of a sudden I was smitten with this vision. I was in the 11th grade and I was taking high school chemistry, which I absolutely hated. The only class I ever hated in all of my education. I just didn't get it. You know, I had an old man who was a teacher and he was pretty good for 80 years old. But I just wanted to know, okay, if you dump this in there, will it explode? It will explode or will not? Is it flammable or non-flammable or inflammable? I just wanted to know, does it flam or does it not flam? And I didn't care about all the periodic chart. I got pretty good grades in high school, but I got a C in chemistry, and my mom was, she was not real happy.
You weren't popular that day, huh?
I was not popular that day. When I read chapters 12, 13, and 14,
that's a great illustration.
I'm back in my classroom in chemistry looking at the pages going, I have no idea what this is. So if you get in a situation where you're looking at an entire chapter and you're thinking, I don't make heads or tails out of that, don't worry, because you're in a long, long line, a long group of people who have studied this book, and that goes back to the first century Christians understanding it. But when we're separated by 2,000 years, it's a dilemma.
Yeah, the periodic table's changed since then.
It has?
Yeah, well, that is a great illustration of, because having taken chemistry in college, and I did okay in college, but the thing is this, not only were there just symbols for complicated structures, there was also numerical value to those symbols. And we're about to get into some things that have symbols and numerical value, and we're sitting there.
And probably we're real people.
With that deer in a headlight look.
That's a good description. No, when Susie and I were dating, there was this guy that knew us really well. We went to the same church, and he told somebody, and I was within listening shot, and he said, oh, Steve and Susie are such a nice couple. They have so much chemistry. And I just wanted to go over there and say,
what are you talking about?
Don't say anything about how I relate to chemistry. Please don't say that.
I thought last week I wanted to bring up something that we went on down. I want to go back to it. We had finished up with I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power. And then immediately after that declaration of God, here comes verse 13 of chapter 12. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. Now that is like, okay, you found out you've lost, and now you're on the people you were trying to beat up in order to take things over. Now you've been exiled to them, what happens now? Well, the woman was given the two wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a times and a half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. There is, for me, there's two elements here that I would like to discuss. One, okay, the woman, which we have kind of deduced as a descriptive, is Judah, Israel, whichever way you want it to imply that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, she's whisked off to protect. Satan can't get to her. Now he's been unleashed on the rest of her offspring. Which, okay, I'm going to step out on a limb and say, okay, if I'm in that period of time I'm reading this, well, that means those who've just been born into this faith that follows this male child. I'm a Gentile, but I'm not a Jew, because the woman would still represent those picked of that, of Israel.
Well, I know this is not a biblical book, but Josephus wrote a book. He was a historian, a Jewish historian in the first century. And he says, and I've read little bits and pieces of it because of things about that thing.
Yeah, he's a rough read.
He says that there was not one Christian who was killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. That they went to a place called Pella, P-E-L-L-A, and they stayed there. And guess how long they stayed there?
42 months.
3.5 years. Now, that is what that could mean,
okay.
Or it could mean something totally different that I don't see, or that other people don't see.
See, that's, again, goes back to some of this stuff. The woman who represents Israel, but that's the thing that I think sometimes some of this confusion can come about, because according to Paul, who ends up becoming Israel? Anyone who obeys God,
The real Jew.
The real Jew, which is who? A follower of the seed of Abraham. That's the real Jew. And that is an Israelite. So that's why I say sometimes, like, it would look like one thing, but it's actually flipped.
And if you'd like to know more about that, if you're listening today, the last 2 paragraphs in Romans 2 tells you who the real Jews are.
Yeah.
Who has the Jewish history in mind? Who has the Jewish from the future? What's going to happen in the future to these Jews?
Yeah.
And not everybody who's a Jew. Not everybody falls under that category of being related to Abraham physically, but they're still Jewish.
Yeah, they're still adopted into the seed, and treated and called real brother, real sister, of Israel. Well, now we'll jump into this 13, which giving a lot of clues to Steve's periodic table of chemistry. This one is just about to go nuts. Would you like for me to read it, or did you want to read it?
You go ahead.
Revelation chapter 13, beginning of verse 1. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horn, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" You want me to keep going or just stop there?
No, that's okay. You can stop there. Now here's the part of the chemistry that I don't understand
Yeah.
in this book. There's a sea beast, and it's ugly looking thing, and there's a land beast, and he's uglier looking than the
Yeah.
other beast. In chapter 13, we're going to come upon a number of the beast, and then in 14, we're going to actually have a name given to us to help us figure out who this beast was. So here's all these things. We already studied in chapter 12 who the woman and the baby and Satan were,
Yeah.
and now we're tossed into a quandary about who are these?
Well, the dragon
Sea beast.
is Satan, as we've been introduced to.
yeah.
And now we have the dragon going off, and now someone comes out of the sea. And of course, to those doing any study in Eastern culture, to all people, made no difference whether they were Jew or from Rome or Greek or Babylon or whatever. Most societies thought that the evil in the world rested inside the sea.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Leviathan was a creature of the sea, which was always used to illustrate Satan sometimes, and of course you've got this creature coming out of the sea, and the people now are enthralled with him.
Well, it's very similar to what we studied last week. These two witnesses that got killed, and they're just laying out there in the middle of the street, and nobody wants to touch them, nobody wants to go near them, and all of a sudden, after 3 days of laying there in the street and nobody bothering you, he got up.
Yep.
He was resurrected. And now we're told that this dragon, this beast, no, not the dragon, but the beast has authority over all these people, and a lot of people on the earth, the whole earth, followed the beast with wonder. Men worship the dragon, that's Satan, for he has given his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" This beast, in the first part of chapter 13, it says has a mortal wound. He's shot
One of the heads.
in one of the heads.
Yeah.
You pick one.
Pick one.
Yeah, see if you can hit one of those heads over there.
It had a mortal wound, but it had healed. Does that
Yes.
mean it was resurrected? Does that mean that it, because, commentators, they go wild with this part.
Oh, when I was a little boy, when John F. Kennedy got shot, I knew people who were waiting for him to come back to life.
Walk out of the
because
city?
he's one of the beasts, and he got shot and killed, and the people that I knew were waiting for him to be resurrected because he was a fulfillment of Revelation 13.
Wow. Well, the other thing that I find
And by the way, he's not. That's not who it
I
was.
know. I knew you didn't mean that. There's a statement made in this chapter that the dragon can give over his authority and power to someone.
Mm-hmm.
Now that is a concept, I don't know about you, but I haven't heard very many Christians speak to this idea about the fact that Satan can turn around and say, "Okay, you gonna be with me? Here you go. I'll give you some of my authority and my power." That's scary.
And who's to say that he wasn't responsible for these people being resurrected? Especially since we can't figure out who the people were that died.
Exactly.
But there are three of them, and then there's a time in chapter 13 where they're all three alive.
Well, the thing that came to my mind as I was reading this, is I'm reminded throughout history of people whose power and authority and wickedness were monumental as to other people. I mean, even in the 19th and 20th century, Adolf Hitler comes to mind as an individual who seemed to have something that no other human had been given. Does that happen?
In just a minute, I will read the list of people that are described exactly what you said.
Yeah, I mean, so going back to your illustration from the very beginning, that in Revelations chapter 1, verse 3, this is all about to happen. But if anything that is absolutely true about the Bible, that it just keeps telling the same story over and over again, that God waits for man, man messes up, then God lets man sin consume him, and then God's there when he cries out and he helps him and then the cycle just keeps repeating over and over through the entire Bible.
Well,
Nothing to say that this can't repeat too.
No, that's one of the reasons I think the difficulty is there, and some people don't even want to approach that difficulty. They don't want to, go through and do the work and do the research and find out. If you back me up in a corner and said, which book have you studied the least in the New Testament? It'd be Revelation would be first, second, and third place.
Yeah, for me too.
Because most people, they give it a try, they give it a shot, and then they get to, 7 and 8's pretty tough, especially when you get to 13 and 14, and they just give up.
Yeah, chemistry's not my favorite class.
Well, and when you give up, in my adult life, I've studied this book a lot, and in college I had 2 classes where we pretty much got our heads filled with all the things that it might have been. Could have been this, could have been that. Here's the sea beast, here's the land beast. Could have been Rome, this could have been Jerusalem.
Yeah, bring in Daniel, bring in Ezekiel, bring in all these prior prophecies and tie everything up in a neat bow, and you still can't make heads or tails out of what's going on.
And that's why I'm so convinced that this book is for people in the first century.
Me too.
God never intended for you and me in 2020 to say, well, this virus thing, we know what that is because in Revelation 13, or these people killing each other in Afghanistan, that's part of. You take everything that's evil, and like you said a little while ago, it's attributed to God. But he still is in control. He's still sovereign. And
he's still, it's sort of like this. It's like, I always like to tell people that it's sort of like being on a ship headed somewhere. The winds change. Does that mean I'm intended to go here, but there's a storm brews up and moves my ship to where it's off course a little bit, but it is able to get back on course to exactly where it wants to go. It seems as God has a plan for where he's taking us, but there's storms, there's evil that comes along that wants to disrupt God from every path. And that's one of the things I think we should talk about from the book of Revelations, not to apply it necessarily to the end times, but to use it as hey, there's a battle that's going on.
In every generation, it teaches that generation lessons.
Yeah.
They may not understand it exactly, and part of that comes out from, we just don't understand the prophecy itself.
We're going to begin reading now in 13:5.
Let me read it.
The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise its authority for 42 months. There's our number again.
Yep.
It opened its mouth, and I like that, it opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Now, I can pretty much guarantee you that verses 9 through 10 are not anybody's favorite verse. If it is, they're not reading it because, in essence, the enemy of God has powers to wage war against the people of God, and it says right there, if anyone's going into captivity they will go. If anyone's going to be killed by the sword, they'll be killed by the sword. God's not going to jump in and stop you from any pain, any suffering, any hurt. Now, this is a version of Christianity that nobody talks about today. They keep wanting to have God sort of like we don't pray for peace and strength. We pray for take this away, Lord. You know, sort of like Paul says, hey, take this thorn out of my side. God looks at him and says, no, my grace is sufficient. You know, deal with it.
Yeah.
You know, you're just going to have to deal with it.
We noticed last week that there are a lot of passages that have judgments in it, and this is one of these judgments. The people who are going to fight for God and the people who are not going to be on God's side, not going to fight, they won't have any endurance, they won't have any faith. But in verse 8, and I'll read this and then I'll just hand this off to you like a baton and you can do with it what you want. All who dwell on the earth will worship it, that's the beast, and everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life and of the Lamb that was slain. Now, he says that God did this before the foundation of the world. He did it before he even created the world. He did what? He left these names off of that book of life. He didn't put those names, and those people who are named in there, not named in there, but people that are designated in there are the ones who follow the beast. And they're the ones that are going to end up on the wrong side of the tracks.
Well, I would disagree with your statement just then.
Well,
only
good.
because of the comma that's in there. It seems to me the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. And all, I know what you're saying, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, which would have been, it's as if, I feel like you're saying that those names were put in there before the creation of the earth. I don't think so.
Is that all you got?
Well, because I think
It's an interesting verse.
Yes, it is an extremely interesting verse.
It shows a scene where God, again in his sovereignty, is looking at a book, and there are certain names that are in there, and there are certain names that are not in there. And the ones, obviously, who are not in there are not going to be the ones who are saved, who are redeemed, who get to go to heaven. But the other ones who are worshiping the beast, he says their names are not in the book of life. So what does that mean, not in the book of life?
Well, I could take that by your statement there, and I could really twist you up and say, well then, why isn't everybody already born with the mark on them that they're one of God's, but yet Paul talks about in Corinthians, only those who end up accepting Jesus Christ get the mark. So,
Now,
you know,
see,
you got it.
now you're going back to chemistry.
I'm going to use the Bible on you to straighten you up on this stuff.
Well, if you're going to straighten me up on Revelation, we're going to be here for a while. We need to call our wives and tell them we'll be late for supper.
Well, the the bottom line is this.
The point is,
I have no ability to.
the point is in this paragraph is there is a book,
There is a book.
and you want your name in that book.
You want your name in that book.
Yes.
But I think that even a greater point to that is that statement, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world, giving to the idea that you may think that Judaism was God's way to get the world right. No, you're not. You're missing the point. That was just the pathway of God to accomplish what He'd already said He was going to accomplish. That Jesus, from the creation of the world, as Paul writes in Philippians and Colossians, was slain under God's plan before He even created the first moon. So it was always part of what was going to happen.
Well, very intelligent biblical scholars have argued that position
I know from
ever
both
since
sides.
ever since Jesus was here. I mean, there are verses that you could look at on both sides, and that's what's scary sometimes. Not necessarily in Revelation, but in other New Testament books, you've got a topic where you have two sides, and you spend. Some of us have spent half of our lives trying to put those pieces back together again because we are Americans and we want to fix things.
Yes.
So I got these verses over here about the sovereignty of God. I got verses over here about the free will of man, and I'm trying to put those together again. And I could name you 6 other topics where there are
Yep.
verses on both sides.
Well, predestined and free will have been at war since they started writing this book.
Were you predestined to say that?
No, I freely
Because
said
if you
that.
were, I'm going to write it down because that sounded really important. You're right. You're exactly right. Where are we going?
Verse 11. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs, it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. It deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to go set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it's the number of man. That number is 666.
A human number.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many little pamphlets or tracts or things like that you get in the mail where somebody has designated somebody as 666. And every one of them, in my adult life, I wrote a list a little while ago about some objectives or some ideas that were born out of this. And the same person who's called 666, and he says it's a man.
Yeah.
It's a number of a man.
And according, giving the part of the story, he was fatally wounded, but then healed. And still yet, this is a man, because the only person up to that time who had been fatally killed but yet been made alive again was Jesus. As far as, Jesus raised a few people from the dead, and I guess in the religious cultures there were other people who they had,
Well, this, rightly so, this person, whoever he is designated as 666, and that's the same almost exactly, in some cases, exact words and exact sentences, where Paul in his epistles, or especially John in 1 John and 2 John, John tells his audience, the Antichrist is already here.
Yeah.
And it has power over the earth, and it's doing something, and it's already here. Well, that goes back to the time is at hand.
The time is at hand.
Chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 3. So the Antichrist, as far as I know, as far as I can tell, the Antichrist and this beast who has the number 666 is the same person. Now, what possibilities could that be? I wrote them down real fast. I'm sure I left some out. Nero Caesar, those people who are preterists, who believe that everything in Revelation was already prophesied, not only prophesied, but also concluded in the New Testament. They look, you do some numerical figure with Nero Caesar and it comes out 666.
Yeah, again, you go back to that periodic table. It's not as, now, our English, we don't put numerical value to letters. But Hebrew and many cultures put numerical values to the letters. And when you spell out the word, it has a numerical value. Nero Caesar, spoken in the Hebrew language,
has numbers.
And his value is 666.
Yeah.
So.
I've also read and heard and listened to people preach sometimes even about the Catholic Church. The majority of the world would say the Catholic Church was the Antichrist or 666. And I'm not trying to belittle my Catholic friends, because I have a lot of them, but I even know some people in the Catholic Church who believe that this 666 came out of the Catholic Church. Okay, maybe it's the Pope, or one of the popes, or all the popes. Maybe it was Martin Luther. Now, here's some really bad guys. Stalin, Lenin, we mentioned Hitler a little while ago. If you say to somebody evil, what do you think of when you think of evil? If Hitler's not in the top,
I don't know where you go.
Yeah. Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, and here's my favorite. Now, I don't remember where I read this, but when I say it, you'll be astute enough to know that I'm not smart enough to figure this out. Some people believe it was Ronald Wilson Reagan, because there are 6 letters in the first name, 6 letters in the middle name, and 6 letters in the last name.
Yeah.
So there's your beast. It has a number, 666, because it's Ronald Wilson Reagan. People take this stuff and just go off, and everybody has some secret that they used to identify who this Antichrist is. When John says they're already here, they're already in the world.
Well, much like the one phrase that you and I have brought up several times, and it keeps being used, if you have ears to hear, listen.
It's right there.
So the problem is, too often we walk into any kind of learning discussion with a preconceived mind or predetermined mind of what it's going to be. And so therefore we lose clarity in what's really trying to be said. And again, going back to what you said from the beginning, and to me this is the part that is absolutely necessary in understanding who and why this book was written. Because if you, like you said, if you and I can't understand it, evidently it really wasn't intended for us as far as the symbols, the numerical values, all these things.
The overall picture.
Their overall picture was not really intended for us. But now, can we learn from this book?
Oh, yeah.
Much. I can learn a lot from some of the writings from very many.
Well, I hope you've been reading it if you can learn a lot from it.
Well, I've learned a lot from various things. It doesn't necessarily mean I always know who the plot is
Sure,
in this thing,
sure.
but it's not necessary for me to know. They needed to know, not me.
They were in the situation that called for that. It called for, what did he say? Endurance and faith.
Endurance and faith, because it's going to get bad. Well, I know we've gone a little long, Steve. We've hit that magic number again, but we actually got through Revelation.
What magic number? 666? Hey,
No.
if anybody has a great concept in their mind about who it is and they can answer that and they can show their proof,
We'll
please
ask-
call us.
Yeah, call us so we
I'll
can
let you sit. I'll let you sit in this chair right here.
Shoot, I'll be on the other side of the camera. Let them have it all, man. I'll tell you. But as always,
And I want people to know that I'm not making fun of the people who believe it's one of these
I know that.
suggestions, but I just want everybody to see that the people who believe this, and there's about 10 suggestions on there, and I'm sure I left some of them out. The people who believe this really believe this.
I know.
They're not making up something. They're not lying. They're not trying to deceive you.
I remember.
They really believe that that's who the Antichrist is.
Yeah, I remember when the barcodes first came out, and everybody was having a conniption fit.
Yep.
And I'm thinking to myself, seriously. But and you may, I don't see it. If you see it that way, God bless you. You're welcome to have, but I can't see it. And I'm not trying to belittle anybody, but
And
I just don't see
as
it.
of this moment in time, you don't have a mark on your forehead or on your hand. At least I looked for that when I came in this morning.
Well, I got a watch has some marks on it on my hand, but yeah, I've got marks on my hand, but that's where I've been beating myself up. On behalf of Steve and I, we are so thankful for the fact that you keep tuning in, that you keep listening, and if you have any questions or any comments, because we're about to get into some areas where I'm going to be kind of disappointed if we don't have comments, because this is seriously confusing, and we're getting to some characters that makes it hard. But as Steve keeps pointing out to us, every chapter has some form of judgment scene in it, and it deals with the consequences and actions that's going to play out. And you and I, as followers of Jesus Christ, need to be made aware of and cognitive of the fact that we live our lives based on an inevitable conclusion. So let's make the right choices given that circumstances. Anything you'd like to say before we head out?
Just if you're disappointed with where you are in Revelation, don't give up, because the whole thesis of the book is it's going to be okay.
It's going to be, hey, if you're with Jesus, you win.
Mm-hmm.
May not be circumstances go well all the time, because this calls for patience, endurance, and faithfulness on the part of God's people. And that part of the story is still going on. On behalf of Steve and I, we look forward to seeing you next week. And Steve, Happy New Year to our friends.
We have friends?
Well, I think we do.
Good.
Happy
Happy New Year.